She had lived in that house for years. A house where love was supposed to flourish. Where promises were made under God. Where trust should have been unbreakable. Yet, as she stood in the doorway that night, everything she had believed shattered before her eyes. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Andrea had spent years trying to be the perfect wife to a man who wore a suit and preached behind a pulpit every Sunday. A man the town trusted, admired, even looked up to for guidance. A man who had stood beside her at the altar and vowed a lifetime of love and faithfulness. But behind closed doors, Andrea's world was far from the perfect picture everyone saw. The man who held the Bible in one hand often turned his back on her. She lived in silence. In loneliness. In confusion, wondering why her husband could never love her the way he loved someone else. She had her suspicions. Affairs were common, even in the holiest of places. She assumed it was another woman. But the truth? The truth was something far more unthinkable. And when Andrea finally discovered it, when she caught it on camera with shaking hands, she could barely comprehend what her own eyes were showing her. The sounds coming from the bedroom that night were not prayers. Not whispers of devotion between a husband and wife. They were the sounds of betrayal. Sounds that would change everything. Andrea had felt it for some time, another presence in her marriage. Someone who always came first. But she never imagined that someone would be a person she had been told to respect. To call family. So, on that fateful night, armed with nothing but her phone and a desperate need for the truth, Andrea approached the room. Her husband was supposed to be alone. He wasn't. What she saw wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It was a betrayal of every moral boundary. Her hands trembled as she hit record. Her voice shook as she confronted them. A confrontation that would ignite a chain of events so dark, so dangerous, so final, that even Andrea could never have predicted how it would all end. I have it all on camera. Everything. And if you think you can hide this, think again. But Andrea didn't realize one thing. The secret she was about to expose? Some people would do anything, to keep it buried. And when she made her demands, thinking she had the upper hand, she unknowingly sealed her own fate. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's a story about trust, shattered. Love, manipulated. And a woman who thought she could escape the darkness, only to be swallowed by it completely. Loyalty. That's what people saw when Andrea sat quietly beside her husband, playing the role of the dutiful pastor's wife. People in their small town often spoke about how blessed they were. A couple who had built a home filled with faith, a marriage that seemed unshakable. But what people saw on Sundays was only part of the story, the part they were meant to see. Behind closed doors, Andrea's life was anything but blessed. What no one knew, what no one could have guessed, was that their home was filled with silence. Long, empty silences that stretched for days. Conversations that should have been filled with love, laughter, or even simple kindness were reduced to cold exchanges, sharp words, and a constant, suffocating loneliness. Jonathan, the man who stood at the pulpit preaching compassion and understanding, barely looked at her. Rarely touched her. And when he did speak, his words weren't gentle. They weren't loving. They were commands. Andrea wasn't his wife. She was just another role in the story of his life. A supporting character. Never the main one. She tried to convince herself that this was just how marriage worked. That maybe other couples also went days without a smile, without a loving glance, without a touch. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't love. This wasn't the life she had promised herself on her wedding day. And yet, she stayed. Because leaving a man like Jonathan, a man respected by the entire community, a man who could do no wrong in the eyes of the church, would mean admitting the truth. And in a town like theirs, where whispers traveled faster than the wind, Andrea knew she would be the one blamed if things fell apart. But there was another reason she stayed. A reason that lived just down the street. A reason that was always watching. Evelyn. Jonathan's mother was seen as a pillar of strength in their town. A grieving widow who had raised her son alone after her husband's sudden death. People admired her resilience, her devotion to her only child. She raised a good man, they would say. Jonathan is who he is because of her. But Andrea saw another side of Evelyn. A side that others either chose not to see, or refused to believe. Because Evelyn wasn't just present in their lives. She controlled them. Every decision Andrea and Jonathan tried to make as a couple, every private conversation, somehow found its way back to Evelyn. If Andrea wanted to buy something for the house, Evelyn had an opinion before Jonathan even responded. If she suggested they take a trip together, Evelyn would find a reason why they shouldn't go. And Jonathan would always listen to her. Not to Andrea. Andrea felt like a guest in her own marriage. A stranger in her own home. Evelyn didn't just visit. She inserted herself into every part of their life. She knew what groceries were bought, what bills were paid, and sometimes even what was cooked for dinner. Andrea often asked herself, why? Why was her husband so loyal to his mother? So loyal that he ignored his wife? At first, she told herself it was because Jonathan had been raised by a single mother. That maybe he felt an obligation to care for her after losing his father. But even that didn't explain the hold Evelyn had over him. This wasn't just devotion. It was something else. Something Andrea couldn't quite name. Something unnatural. She would watch them, Jonathan and Evelyn, exchanging looks across the room that she didn't understand. Private glances during family dinners. Conversations that would stop the moment she walked in. And when she confronted her husband about it, Jonathan would always dismiss her, coldly and without hesitation. You're overthinking it. You know how much my mother means to me. Stop being jealous. But Andrea knew this wasn't jealousy. This was something else. Something she was determined to uncover. But what Andrea didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the truth about her husband and his mother was darker than anything she could have imagined. And soon, her search for answers would pull her into a web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal, one that would cost her far more than just her marriage. Because long before Andrea entered the picture, before vows were exchanged, before Jonathan became a man of faith in the eyes of the town, there was only him and his mother. A mother and son bound together in a way that seemed unbreakable. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about their closeness. People whispered about how much Evelyn adored her son. She's just protective of him, that's all. Mothers and sons have a special bond. And no one questioned it. No one wanted to question it. Because people see what they want to see. A grieving widow. A devoted mother. A good, God-fearing man. But beneath the surface, beneath the facade, something was very, very wrong. And Andrea was about to find out just how deep the darkness ran. But what people didn't see, what no one ever dared to acknowledge, was that Jonathan wasn't just a son to his mother. He was everything. Evelyn never remarried after her husband's tragic passing. She never dated. Never sought companionship. Never allowed another man into her life. Instead, she poured all of her energy, all of her devotion, and all of her love into one person. Her son. She was his entire world. And he was hers. But the problem with centering your entire existence around one person? Eventually, that person will try to leave. And Evelyn? She was never going to let that happen. Jonathan grew up under her watchful eye. She was always there. Always ensuring he never strayed too far. While other boys rode their bikes through town, snuck out to meet girls, or tested the boundaries of their independence, Jonathan was with her. Always with her. She was his guide. His protector. His only real influence. There was no decision he could make without her approval. No thought he could have without her shaping it first. And if he ever pulled away, even slightly, she knew exactly how to pull him back in. Soft words. Gentle hands. Reminders. Reminders of everything she had done for him. Reminders that without her, he was nothing. No one will ever love you like I do. Jonathan heard those words over and over as he grew up. And for a long time, he believed them. But then Jonathan became a man. And Evelyn had a problem. The expectations of the world around them. A respected pastor needed a wife. A church leader needed a family. A man of faith needed to be seen as exactly that. And so, a woman had to be chosen. Not for love. Not for companionship. For convenience. Someone who could play the role that the world required. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Someone who wouldn't challenge him. Someone who could never, ever take Evelyn's place. Andrea was never chosen for love. She was chosen to maintain the illusion. Because Jonathan's marriage wasn't about building a life. It was about hiding secrets. It was about preserving the image Evelyn had spent decades crafting. The image an entire town believed in. And so, Andrea found herself trapped in a role she never even realized she had been cast in. Have you ever known a family dynamic that felt off? A relationship that seemed a little too close? Something that didn't quite make sense, yet no one dared to question? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're still watching, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because this case? It's only getting darker from here. Andrea wasn't going to stay silent forever. She wasn't going to keep accepting the cold glances, the silences, the walls Jonathan had built between them. She was done pretending. Andrea was going to find the truth. And when she did, she would finally see the full, horrifying picture of the man she had married. By the time she uncovered it, she was already in danger. For years, Andrea had ignored the voice in her head. The quiet but persistent whisper that told her something wasn't right. Something about her marriage didn't make sense. Something about the way Jonathan treated her, about the way he relied on his mother for everything, felt unnatural. She told herself to be patient. Maybe things would change. Maybe Jonathan would learn to love her the way a husband should. Maybe Evelyn would step back and let them build a life together. But deep down, Andrea knew she was lying to herself. Because with every passing day, Jonathan and Evelyn only seemed to grow closer. And Andrea felt more and more like a stranger in her own home. It started as small things. Things she could have brushed off, if she hadn't been looking. The way Jonathan disappeared into his mother's house for hours, sometimes late into the night, long after Andrea had gone to bed. The hushed phone calls that ended the moment she entered the room. The glances they exchanged, glances filled with meaning she couldn't quite understand. At first, Andrea convinced herself she was imagining things. After all, who would ever suspect something like that? Who would question a mother and son, especially one so beloved by the town? But the closer she looked, the harder it became to ignore. Because Jonathan was hiding something. And Evelyn was hiding it with him. Andrea reached her breaking point the night Jonathan came home after midnight. His clothes were disheveled. When she asked where he had been, he didn't even bother to lie. With my mother. No explanation. No apology. As if that answer should have been enough. That was the moment Andrea knew. Jonathan was never going to tell her the truth. And Evelyn? Evelyn had never wanted her there in the first place. So Andrea made a decision. A decision that would change everything. That night, while the house was empty and silent, Andrea crept through the living room, carefully setting up a hidden camera. She angled it perfectly, aimed toward the hallway that led to their bedroom. She knew Jonathan and Evelyn thought she was asleep when they met in secret. But this time, she would see what they were doing when they thought no one was watching. Andrea sat in the dark after planting the camera, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she would find. And part of her hoped, prayed, that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. That maybe she was imagining things. That maybe it was innocent. But when she played back the footage the next morning, her world collapsed. On the screen, she watched as Jonathan walked into the house with Evelyn. They spoke in hushed voices, too low for the microphone to pick up. Then, they disappeared down the hallway. Andrea stared at the screen for hours, watching as Jonathan and his mother reappeared later. Fixing their clothes. Whispering. Laughing. Like they shared a secret no one else in the world could ever know. She couldn't deny it anymore. The truth was right in front of her. A truth so devastating, so destructive, that it broke something inside her forever. Andrea knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She had to confront them. She had to let them know that she knew. And she was done pretending. The next evening, when Jonathan and Evelyn thought the house was empty, Andrea waited. She waited until she heard their voices in the living room, until she knew they were comfortable, unaware that she was there. Then, she walked in. Phone in hand. Recording. Her voice was calm, but shaking with rage. With pain. With betrayal. I know everything. And I have it all on camera. Jonathan and Evelyn froze. For the first time, they looked scared. They tried to stay calm, but Andrea could see it in their eyes. The panic. The realization that she had the power now. That she could destroy everything they had built on lies. Her plan was simple. Take the money. Leave town. Never look back. She told them she wanted $110,000. Enough to start over. Enough to disappear. And if they didn't give it to her? Everyone in town would see what they had been hiding. For the first time, Jonathan and Evelyn had no control. Or at least, that's what Andrea thought. What she didn't realize was that the moment she threatened to expose them, she became something else. A liability. And Jonathan and Evelyn? They weren't going to let her walk away that easily. Andrea thought she had taken back control. But she had just made herself their next target. For a brief moment, after Andrea confronted them with the truth, there was silence. A silence so thick, so suffocating, it felt like the whole house was holding its breath. Jonathan was the first to speak. His voice was calm. Too calm. Let's not do anything crazy. We can talk about this. Evelyn followed, her voice soft. Soothing. Sit down, dear. Let's talk this through. No need to bring other people into our family business. To anyone listening from the outside, it might have sounded like peace. Like they wanted to fix things. But Andrea knew better. She saw the way Jonathan's fists clenched. She saw the way Evelyn's eyes never quite met hers. She could feel the danger in the room. Still, she sat down. Maybe because part of her wanted to believe them. Maybe because she was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of the lies. Or maybe because she thought she was safe. But Andrea wasn't naive. Before she walked into that house, for what would be the last time, she made a phone call. A call she knew she had to make. If anything happens to me tonight, you know who's responsible. That call was her last act of hope. A hope that if she didn't make it out of that house, someone would know who to blame. Jonathan and Evelyn sat across from her, their voices calm. But Andrea knew the truth. She saw the cracks. She saw the fear. She held the power now. Or at least, that's what she thought. Because in that moment, as she stared across the table, Andrea had no idea. She had already lost. Andrea sat motionless, her phone resting quietly on the table beside her, recording everything. She fought to keep her face calm, but inside, she was shaking. She knew these people. She knew they weren't negotiating. They were stalling. Thinking. Planning. Andrea just needed to make it through the night. Take the money. Leave town. But before she could move, before she could turn her escape into reality, everything changed. What happened next was sudden. Brutal. So fast, she barely had time to understand. One moment, Evelyn was standing up to refill her tea. The next, she was behind Andrea. Her hands moved quickly. Deliberately. And Jonathan was standing too. But now, he was holding something. Something sharp. Something heavy. There was no time to scream. No time to run. The people she had once trusted, the man she had married, the woman she had tried to call family, turned on her in an instant. Jonathan swung the object in his hand. The last thing Andrea felt was the cold, crushing force against her skull. Then, darkness. Her body hit the floor with a sickening thud. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the kitchen tiles. Jonathan and Evelyn stood over her motionless form, breathing heavily. Panic flickered in Evelyn's eyes. We have to clean this up. Now. They didn't hesitate. They didn't mourn. Because to them, Andrea wasn't a person anymore. She was a problem that needed to disappear. They worked methodically, like they had planned for this moment. Jonathan dragged her lifeless body across the floor. Evelyn brought out knives, plastic sheets, things no grieving husband and mother should have on hand. They carved her up like she was nothing more than meat. 150 pieces. Sealed in plastic bags. Dumped. Disposed of. As if Andrea Owens had never existed. But secrets don't stay buried forever. What Jonathan and Evelyn never imagined, never planned for, was that Andrea had already set her escape plan in motion. Even as they tried to erase her, she had left behind a trail. A trail that would lead straight to them. Because that phone call she made? It wasn't just a warning. It was evidence. And the one person Andrea trusted with her life was already preparing to fight for her. When hours turned into an entire day and Andrea still hadn't been heard from, her best friend knew something was wrong. She wasted no time. She called the police. She told them everything, Andrea's fears, her suspicions, her desperate plea for help before she vanished. The officers arrived at Andrea's home. The first thing they noticed? Her car was still there. Her phone was missing. But her purse, her keys, her personal belongings? Untouched. It was as if she had simply vanished. Then, they listened to the voicemail. The message Andrea had left just hours before she disappeared. Her voice, steady but filled with fear. If anything happens to me tonight, you know who's responsible. And with those words, everything changed. What first seemed like a simple missing persons case now became something much darker. A case of betrayal. A case of violence. A case of cold, calculated murder. Investigators searched Andrea's home, and what they found peeled back the layers of the life she had been trapped in. Hidden away in her personal files, stored carefully on a backup device no one knew existed, were the secret recordings. Andrea had been documenting everything. Whispers between Jonathan and Evelyn. Private moments that no one in the church, no one in that entire town, would have ever imagined. Conversations that should have never been heard. It was undeniable. The police now had a window into Andrea's world. A world of fear. A world of manipulation. A world of betrayal. A world she had been desperate to escape. When the news broke, people refused to believe it. Jonathan, Pastor Jonathan, accused of murdering his own wife? Evelyn, the saintly widow, hiding a monstrous secret? It didn't make sense. People didn't want it to be true. But as more evidence surfaced, denial was no longer an option. The congregation was devastated. The same man who had baptized their children, who had prayed with them in their darkest moments, was now exposed as a liar. And his mother? The woman they had admired, was something else entirely. Whispers turned to gasps. Gasps turned to outrage. People began to question everything. Had they been too quick to admire Jonathan's devotion to his mother? Too quick to excuse the way he always put her first? Too blind to see the truth right in front of them? And as the investigation deepened, more people came forward. Friends of Andrea. Quiet confessions about the things she had told them. Her fear. Her loneliness. Her suspicions. Things that now, in the harsh light of the truth, made perfect sense. Andrea had believed in her marriage. She had believed in Jonathan. Believed in the vows they made before God, before their families, before their entire community. She believed in the man she thought he was. Until the truth became impossible to ignore. And when she finally fought back, when she threatened to expose them, it cost her everything. But the truth wasn't buried with Andrea. Jonathan and Evelyn had spent years controlling the narrative. Now, they had lost control. Completely. As the courtroom doors opened for their trial, the town gathered in hushed silence. It was standing room only. Not for the spectacle. But because they needed to understand. How had they been deceived for so long? How had they trusted two people who were capable of something so unimaginable? Jonathan sat at the defendant's table, his eyes fixed on the floor. No longer the confident pastor. No longer the man who stood before crowds preaching forgiveness and grace. And beside him, Evelyn. Calm. Composed. As if she still believed she could control what was about to unfold. But as the trial began, it became clear that neither of them could control what was coming next. Piece by piece, the truth was about to be laid bare. And justice? Justice was finally coming for them both. The courtroom was silent. Then, Andrea's voice filled the room. Her final words. The voicemail she had left behind, a desperate warning no one had heard until it was too late. Next came the recordings. Secret footage. Conversations between Jonathan and Evelyn, whispers of quiet, careful planning. The jury sat frozen, their expressions unreadable, as Jonathan and Evelyn's own words echoed through the courtroom. A confession neither of them had ever meant to make. By the time the prosecution rested, there was little left to argue. The evidence was overwhelming. The picture was clear. The jury deliberated for hours. And when they returned, the verdict was read aloud. Guilty. Jonathan and Evelyn were sentenced to life in prison without parole. A sentence that, in some ways, brought justice for Andrea. But in other ways, it was never enough. No verdict could bring Andrea back. No punishment could undo what had been done. No prison walls could erase the betrayal she had suffered at the hands of the two people who should have never harmed her. As the courtroom emptied, as reporters flooded the airwaves with news of the shocking trial, one question lingered. A question that would haunt the town long after the gavel fell. Was Jonathan simply a man manipulated by his mother? Or was he fully aware, fully complicit, in every terrible act? Some believed Evelyn had controlled Jonathan from the beginning. That he was nothing more than a boy trapped in a web of emotional dependency, unable to break free, even as an adult. That she had shaped his mind, his choices, until he no longer knew right from wrong. But others argued that Jonathan wasn't an innocent victim. That he had known exactly what he was doing. That he had chosen, again and again, to protect himself and his mother at Andrea's expense. And then there was Andrea. Could she have escaped a different way? Could she have walked away before it was too late? These are the questions that remain. The questions that may never truly be answered. For the church, the fallout was devastating. People who had once trusted Jonathan with their deepest sins, who had sought his guidance in their darkest moments, now sat in the pews, filled with nothing but emptiness, grief, and anger. Some left the church forever, unable to reconcile the man they had followed with the monster exposed in court. Others stayed, but the trust that once bound them as a congregation was shattered. Broken in ways that might never heal. Neighbors who had admired Evelyn for her strength as a widow now saw her for what she truly was. A woman whose influence over her son had led to an act of unthinkable cruelty. Andrea's story is not just a tragedy. It's a warning. A warning about the dangers of secrets. About the masks people wear. And about how love, when twisted and corrupted, can become something else. Something dangerous. something deadly. So now, I ask you, what do you think? Was Jonathan just another victim of his mother's control? Or was he just as responsible as she was? And if you were in Andrea's position, if you knew a secret that could destroy everything but might also cost you your life, what would you do? Would you risk everything to expose the truth? Or would you walk away to protect yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. These are the kinds of questions that don't have easy answers. And maybe, they never will. If this story left you speechless, please like, comment, and share, so more people can hear Andrea's story. And perhaps, learn to see the warning signs she saw too late. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real stories of love, lies, and betrayal, forget to subscribe. Because some stories? Some are even darker than this one.